Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Boogie Board Tiki Bar. Today, I am delighted to be joined by Gabe Rothman. He is the Vice President of Operations at Rescale. Gabe, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Good to see you again, Kevin.
It's good to see you too. Now, we're recording this just before the holidays, so it is the holiday season. And are you in wine country right now?
I am. Yeah, I live
Okay.
in a little town called Glen Ellen, which is just north of Sonoma.
And how is Glen Ellen during holiday season?
It's beautiful. It's one of the only places in the Bay Area where you get sort of a quasi changing of the seasons because the grape vines are deciduous. So you get that like transition from green to reds and yellows and whatnot. So it's pretty cool.
I love that. It gives a
Yeah.
reason to celebrate. I always like to start with your personal journey. I imagine if I'm talking to 8-year-old Gabe, he does not yet know that he wants to be a VP of operations. So, what did you want to be when you grew up?
I wanted to be a professional baseball player.
You wanted to be a professional baseball player. And did you grow up in California?
I did. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, one of those things. I was pretty damn good at baseball until basically high school. And then I was pretty good in high school, but you realize one of the guys on the baseball team at my high school is a guy named Chad Hutchinson, who later he was starting pitcher and quarterback at Stanford, and then was a pitcher for the Cardinals. And then when his baseball career sort of fizzled out, he was like, well, I'll just try football, and was the quarterback for the Cowboys for a minute. And so when you play with someone at that level, you're like, oh, okay, yeah. I can see what a professional baseball player looks like.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. I always wonder if those people are just when they're sitting, is it like, do they just have a different feel in their body? Are they like twitching and ready to jump at all times? Or what is it that's different? But
I think
you know
they
what,
are.
you're doing okay. You're doing okay. So professional baseball didn't work out, but
No.
what did you go to school for then?
I went to school for, if I'm being perfectly honest, I went to school for socializing. It took me a while, I'll be honest. It took me a minute to like find myself. I graduated from high school young. I started school early on. So I was still 17 my freshman year of college. So I was a little green, didn't really know my place in the world. And on top of that, I grew up in North San Diego County in the 80s and 90s, which was a wonderful childhood, great place to grow up. But like, it's not the most worldly existence. It's a pretty like sheltered, bubbly existence. So I had some growing up to do when I got to college. And so I went to UCLA, which was a great experience. And I started out at UCLA studying molecular biology. And then, like I said, I wasn't the most mature. So I just kind of like a little bit took the path of least resistance and eventually ended up as an English major, mostly because English was easy for me. I was like, this is great. I can read fast. I can retain information. I'm a good writer. So yeah, I'll just do that. So to be very blunt, I was a very lazy student in undergrad. I didn't have my priorities quite straight.
Well, we would have gone along very well, Gabe. We would have had lots of drinks on Tuesdays and Wednesdays afternoons,
Yep.
gotten the requisite B on our. I was a marketing major and you're an English major, and then
You know what I'm talking about.
have a good weekend. So
Yeah.
absolutely. But I appreciate your candor. So then at some point you do get introduced to the working world. Now I'm not sure if you're working odd jobs at all up to that point, but then you do graduate and move into the working world. What's that transition like for you?
Also rocky. So I moved to the Bay Area in 2000, so right after I graduated. And my initial goal was like, oh, I'll move to the Bay Area. I really like San Francisco. It's a super cool cosmopolitan city. I'll move up here with some buddies. It's like the epicenter of like the tech world. I'll try to work in tech. You'll note that I said I moved to the Bay Area in the year 2000, which was a very bad year to try to break into the tech world. So
Yeah.
didn't really work out the first time. My first job was at a company called Focal Communications. And they were doing like it's been so long, so I may be wrong about this, but if I recall, I think it was like early, like voice over IP or like co-location, one of those
Okay.
two things. And we were if anyone who has lived in the Bay Area for a long time knows this building. At the time, it was the Sega building, later on became Zynga's headquarters, and now it's, I think, a headquarters of a bunch of different companies. So, and I remember it was really sad. Like, I worked there for several months, and I think it was the top floor of that building was Tech TV. And right, like a few months into it, the tech economy, the bubble burst, or it had already burst, but things were going bad. And I remember every Friday, it was just like an exodus, mass
Mm.
exodus of people carrying cardboard boxes with their stuff in it. It was very sad. So that didn't work. It didn't work out. That company ended up not working out for me. I just wasn't focused on wanting to like build a career at that point. So very long story short, I worked a bunch of different various jobs there. I worked at DHL, Worldwide Express's corporate headquarters for a minute, but like nothing was a career. I was sort of like, I have a bunch of buddies that I'm still very tight with that I lived with at that time. And all of us, to a man, refer to that like period of our lives as college too. And that's kind of what we're doing. So I did what a lot of people who are reasonably intelligent and can write well and sort of don't know what else to do. I went to law school. And so starting in 2004, I went to, used to be called UC Hastings Law School, is now called, I can never get this right. It's like a weird, awkward name they changed it to. I think it is UC Law San Francisco is the name of the school now. So it's basically like, it's a UC school, but it's specifically only for law. So it's similar, like UCSF is only like biosciences and medicine. UC Hastings is law. So I went to law school there, and law school was wonderful. I had a really good time, learned a ton, built a very, very useful skills that I, despite the fact that I obviously no longer practice law, still use today, and went out in the world and went to practice law. And I have very good, you're going to realize here, for that period of my life, I had really, really outstanding timing because I graduated law school in 2007. So I graduated undergrad in 2000, just in time for that bubble to burst. And I graduated law school in 2007, just in time for the mortgage crisis to hit.
Yeah.
So I had a job lined up in like public interest law, and that fell through once the mortgage crisis hit, and a bunch of government funding and various companies started going under, that kind of stuff. And so I ended up having to scramble to get a job, and I landed a job doing insurance litigation, mostly in the construction industry. So like defending insurance companies initially, which was soul-suckingly terrible.
Mm.
Wasn't for me. I didn't like it. So I switched sides and started doing plaintiff side work in the same general field.
Okay.
But and that was better, but ultimately just not for me. It wasn't where I needed to be. So after about 4-ish years practicing law, I quit without a job and decided to make the switch to a new career, and figured, well, I tried this tech thing once, let's try it again. Let's see if we can make hay. So I actually paused there. I don't know if you wanted to interject.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. So, I mean, I think you have a little more drive probably at that point than you're giving yourself credit for, because you do go to law school. You're a practicing attorney for
yeah,
a
by
number
that
of
time
years.
I did. Yeah, certainly by that time. It was just
Rock
the
on.
first few years out of undergrad that I was sort of screwing around.
So then when you get back into tech, I can see it, it looks like on LinkedIn you're learning some of the systems side of the house, you're doing some consulting work. What about it catches for you?
Well, so some of it was just luck and serendipity, and some of it was well, I'll say initially a lot of it was sort of luck and serendipity. So like it took me about 10 months to find my first job. I didn't really have a skill set that made sort of perfect sense. It wasn't like a perfect puzzle piece for any particular role, right? Like if I wanted to be a lawyer in the tech world, I didn't really have like a lot of transactional experience, or even from a litigation perspective, I didn't have a lot of, sorry, my dog is
You're good.
bumping into me. I'll show you. He's just hanging out. So I didn't have the type of exact like law experience that would translate. And then, I didn't have a marketing degree, and I hadn't really done sales. So I had to do a lot of sort of like networking and job hunting by, I don't know, like analogy, right? I had to kind of like, I did a lot of like informational interviews and interviews for actual jobs. And I spent a lot of that time sort of crafting my pitch around like, how do I like convince people that they should hire me? Like, what is going to make sense for these companies? Like I said, it took about 10 months to find a role. And one of the things that really kind of like I think helped me develop the pitch that ultimately worked was a former law colleague of mine connected me with a friend of his, just totally unrelated to work, but he just happened to be friends with this guy, a guy named Luke, who was the VP of product at Zuora at the time. So this was like 2011, I think, or 2012 maybe. And I met up with him and we grabbed breakfast and I told him what I was trying to do. And he was like, we got along great. He said, yeah, I think you'd be a good fit. Let's try to figure out if there's like a place for you at Zuora. So he actually connected me directly with Teen Zuo, their CEO. And so I had an interview with Teen and he absolutely kicked my ass in this interview. It was and not like he wasn't mean or rude. He was just direct. And it was really good to like see like, oh, okay, this is what the founder, CEO of like a major league company in this space wants, right? And I have a vivid memory of in the interview, we're going through it, and he basically said, I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said like, hey, look, you're obviously smart, you're obviously motivated. I was 33 at the time because again, I was making a career switch. He said, but like, why would I hire you versus some other smart, motivated person who's 24 and just out of Harvard or some, right? Like, why would I do that? Like, what differentiates you? Like, what metrics can you point to in your career that like would differentiate you? And I thought about it and I was kind of like, oh, that's a really good question. And I was like, I don't know if I can point to any metrics in my career that matter to you. I can tell you stuff that happened in my law career, but like I don't know how much that matters. So I was basically like, what if I don't have any that matter? And he looked at me, he leaned and he said, get some. And it was really good. I didn't get a job at Zuora, but it was a really, really good experience to like, and I was oddly not sad or disappointed about it. I was like sort of considering like from any outward point of view how poorly the interview went, at least in the context of like the goal of getting a job. I was pretty happy about it because it just, for some reason, it made me realize like now I know what I need to do. And like this guy didn't tell me he didn't like me or like would never hire me. He said, yeah, I could see hiring you, but like, why? Right. Yeah. So that was a really good interview. Long story short, I changed my approach and I landed a job at Blue Wolf about 4 months later, doing Salesforce ecosystem, RevOps consulting, and the technical stuff just happened to really work for me. It was just, there was a lot of things about the role that I took to right away, and I was pretty good at early on. But for whatever reason, the technical side of things just like really clicked with the way that I think. And I do think that to some extent, I've said this to folks in the past too. I do think to some extent, it doesn't immediately make like intuitively obvious sense, but law school was actually really useful, and my legal career in kind of creating a framework that works, especially for problem solving and like requirements gathering, solution design in this space. And that's because the way that they teach you to think in the law is you have a menu of components, things that you can use to develop an argument. So if you're writing a brief, for example, for court, you're going to go to court and you're going to argue some point of law. You have a bunch of tools at your disposal, right? You've got the rules of civil procedure. You have the local rules of the court you're arguing. You have legal precedent. You have like state statutes. You've got the facts, the facts of the case, right? You have all these different things, and you have to pluck from all of those things the most salient and useful ones for your point. And then like in the context of say like a motion for summary judgment, you have 15 pages to make your case and that's it, right? So you have a lot of like constraints and parameters, and your job is to take all of these different components and construct them into the most compelling argument in this limited set of time constraints, pages, whatever. That's a really good analogy for what you have to do when you're solutioning things, whether it's for a client in consulting or like RevOps in-house. And so that was a really good sort of like framework early on.
That makes a lot of sense. You appear to kind of move up quickly once you started doing that type of work and into leadership positions. I'm curious what your experience was like transitioning from, okay, now I've got like a job motion and a career that I feel like is catching. But now I have to switch from being an IC to a people manager, which is like a totally different function. What was that like for you?
So the interesting thing is this: my first role at Blue Wolf was an IC role, but I quickly transitioned into leadership there. And then by the time I left Blue Wolf, I was co-running that department. So there were actually like, I think there were maybe 15-ish people in the department, and we managed like the whole book of business across the department for all the different clients. And then when I transitioned into more like an in-house context, started working at startups with PagerDuty, I went back to IC, right? And then I was IC at PagerDuty. I was like a super IC director at Lookout. And then when I moved to Mesosphere, I started managing a team, and then at Rescale built out the team starting in 2019. So built out the entire like RevOps organization. So I think from like a people management perspective, not Lookout, Blue Wolf was a good sort of like initial kind of exposure to that. And it came somewhat easily to me in that context. One reason was that most of the people that worked in my department at Blue Wolf were much younger than me. The nature of that department was that it was like a lot of people that were like fresh out of college or maybe like second job. And that was part of the business model, was that like you get people who are smart, motivated, train them up. It's cheap, right? Because they're young. And that kind of worked for them with respect to hiring me, because I was like, well, I need to make a career change. So I'll take a pay cut just to make the switch. But being between, 5 and 10-ish years older than everyone, it made it a little easier to take on kind of like a mentorship role just from an experience point of view. I didn't have more experience than them in the specific like subject matter, but I mean, I had been running lawsuits, legal files for 4 years, right? Multiple different like clients simultaneously going to court, arguing in front of judges, things that are, challenging and put you in sort of like a high stress situation, right? One of the things was sort of, judges can be very cranky. They tend to be very experienced, lawyers, and they have to deal with a lot of BS in their courtrooms. And so they don't have a lot of patience. And so like, if you've been yelled at by a judge in court, like you can handle a cranky customer. And then the mentorship aspect of being a team lead sort of came easy to me. I think it's something that it's a little bit of a like feature of my personality. I just have always been able to connect with people easily. And one of the things that I try to do, again, something that's always kind of been a little bit of a personality feature of mine, but that I've definitely tried to cultivate, is a lot of people will call it sort of like servant leadership or whatever. There's a lot of like different buzzwords for this, but the way I think about it is like leading people with a sort of combination of confidence and humility. And I think that actually confidence and humility they're sort of two sides of the same coin.
It's a really good point, is that confidence and humility, like they could be seen as opposites, right? Or that a person who has confidence might lack humility and vice versa. Your view is the opposite, is that they actually go hand in hand. You care to describe that?
Yeah. So yeah, I think that like you can't really truly be humble without confidence, right? What looks like humility is actually self-deprecation or worse, right? If you don't have confidence in your skills, your ability to lead, whatever it is, right? And at the same time, like if you're leading people, there's no reason not to have humility if you are truly confident in your skills and like confident in your ability to drive change, be a strategic thinker, whatnot. Because I think what that ends up looking like a lot is people who say like have to have a monopoly on ideas, right? They're in their team, they're leading the team, and like they either like can't acknowledge the good ideas of others and will like disregard them, or people who need to sort of like, and I think that's also kind of where these management styles of like micromanagement, hypervigilance around control, right? It's because they don't have the confidence to like defer credit, right? And so that's why I think like a combination of confidence and humility, which again is something that the humility part, I think when I was younger, I had more access to. Confidence took me a while. Starting in my like 20s, I think really like in law school, I started to really develop a strong sense of confidence, and then that's grown. And then obviously realizing when I moved into the tech world that it was just something that I happened to be good at.
Mm.
But from a leadership standpoint, I sort of took that approach early on of like, hey, let's just all kind of like be great together. We're all going to get credit. If like the customer's happy, everybody on this team is going to get credit. So anyway, that's I know I started to ramble a bit there, but that's kind of how I think about it. Like I think one of the most important features of leadership is the ability to both like exude confidence, but also the humility to be like, everybody on my team is great. Everybody has good ideas. Let's all try to like be fantastic together, right? This like rising tide lifts all boats kind of concept.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And I'm going to kind of mega fast forward now, because after it clicks for you, you enter leadership roles, you're now building out a whole function at Rescale. I'm curious how you are able to stay fresh on technology. Things are coming out at a rapid pace. Obviously, you have now a technical background. How do you keep your eyes up on what's out there while also keeping your heads down on running the business?
So you mean technology sort of across the board, anything that happens to like live in the world of say RevOps, or even like specifically, like for example, the RevOps world is very different than what Rescale does as a company, right? The world that we
Yeah,
live
sorry. So I mean more for your role. So for like for RevOps, like there's going to be a new system that can help you XYZ reason, right? And it's coming out now, new AI tools coming out now. Many of them may help you. You also have to run your existing business and systems today. How do you think about that trade-off of researching, knowing what's coming up in the fold, making sure you're cutting edge while also not changing course every 5 minutes?
I think it's a combination of things. So to some extent, there's just like an element of intellectual curiosity, of just like, I think this stuff is interesting and cool. So I'm on LinkedIn, just, sometimes just scrolling through my feed, seeing if there's anything interesting there, seeing what people are talking about. Some of it is, a lot of it these days, I'm sure you're aware, you don't really have to like look too hard. You can just go, and every once in a while, like for example, I use Superhuman for my email. And so one of my inbox splits it's actually intended to get it all out of my face, is a split that basically takes anything that hits my inbox with like an unsubscribe or a like subscription preferences, and it puts it into a separate split that I can ignore, which is a whole other thing. But there's so much stuff in there, like I can just every few weeks, a month, whatever, just kind of do a visual scan through there and be like, oh, is there anything interesting in there? And so I'll do that. And then a lot of it is driven by business need. I try not to. I've actually evolved quite a bit in this area since early in my career, because when I first got into this world, I was still very much like excited about how cool all this tech was, and like especially all the cool stuff you could do in Salesforce and the broader Salesforce ecosystem from an automation standpoint. That stuff like really got me excited, and I was really into it, and I still am, but differently. And so back then I was very apt to like chase a lot of like cool things because they seem cool. Like, oh, it'd be cool if we could do, that's a really neat thing. And you start to realize, the further up you go in your career, like that, like neat is intellectually interesting, but it doesn't necessarily move the needle, or frequently does not move the needle strategically. business. And so I've evolved to the point now where I, to some extent, deliberately ignore a lot of the like noise around new tooling until I have a business need, right? So I don't completely ignore it, right? Like I said, I'm in LinkedIn. I'm kind of like visually scanning my email from time to time, but a lot of it is based on the needs of the business, right? So a lot of times I'm constantly evaluating like, what does Rescale need? And then if there is something where I'm like, we don't really have a good solution for this, let's see what the market has to offer, then I'll go and really like dive into it. And then there are other scenarios where like sometimes, actually, I would say more often than not recently, tools that we buy have frequently come to me from former colleagues, people that I know in the business, friends or former colleagues that are maybe like investors in a company. And they say, hey, like I'm an investor in this company. This is a really cool thing they do. Why don't you take a look?
Yeah.
And those have actually borne fruit in a number of ways with some really, really cool, interesting, useful products. So
Awesome.
I would say it's like a combination of all those things. But like fundamentally, when it comes to how do I approach implementing tech and evaluating tech for Rescale, first and foremost, it's always business need, right? And I do think that that's like a thing that a lot of people need to develop, which is the understanding that like you don't actually need nearly as much tech as sometimes it seems. It's more about like being smart in how you deploy it. We've been undergoing for probably 2 years now a fairly consistent contraction of our stack, or at least consolidation of tools into like solutions that sort of can carry the weight of like multiple different features, moving things into Salesforce, deciding whether to build things at home. In the last 2 years, we removed Gong, we removed features from our Zoom Info implementation. We removed our forecasting tool and went with just like standard Salesforce forecasting. And now that we like have consolidated things down and gotten them to a place where like things are really tight and our spend has contracted quite a bit, now we're starting to kind of like grow it again incrementally per our various needs, right? So like we don't have Dong anymore. We just bought Salesforce sales engagement because we want to keep our BDR team in SFDC as much as possible. We'll probably deprecate outreach and just use cadences in Salesforce. And it's not like a criticism of Gong or outreach. Like, those are good tools. Those are very good tools. But for what we need, like we don't need 3 different tools to do this job. We need one tool. So that's kind of how I think about it.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Bred from need and a little more fundamentally focused than earlier in your career. I can appreciate that.
Yeah.
You have time for one more question?
I do. Actually, I would add one more thing too. Obviously, like everyone is trying to stay on top of AI right now, right? And it's really important to both be cognizant of the fact that like it's going to change the way all of our jobs work and our companies work, but also like be cognizant of like the fact that we don't know for sure how that's going to manifest yet. We can see it in some ways, but trying to be very like conservative about not like chasing every cool little thing that comes down the pipe, right? So being very like aware of the fact that like we are going to need to implement AI functionality, but also trying to be conservative about how we approach it, right? So the biggest thing we're doing right now is around content management, right? We're trying to like, because content management is really, really hard, right? Content management systems come with like a ton of administrative burden potentially. And that's an area where I actually think AI can do a really good job of trying to ease like the administrative burden of content management, right? You don't have to store everything in the content management system. You can store it wherever you need it and aggregate it in the content management system and have the AI keep track of it and tag it and that kind of stuff. So that's just an example of we're thinking about like we need to be aware of what AI is going to do, but we need to be conservative and not just like throw dollars at it until we're sure of like how it can actually help our business.
Absolutely. I think that's great advice. Okay. So my final question. So now you've started your career in tech during second college, which I like a lot. Get through being a lawyer, and then it catches for you in your next run. And you've now done some really cool things and hold an executive position at an exciting software company. So I think a lot of people might hear your story and think, okay, like that's cool. I think I'd like to emulate that. I want to be like Gabe and have a similar career. Like what advice would you give to maybe your younger self who's trying to figure it out, or to that person about a career?
Yeah, I would help my younger self better understand what people back then meant when they said, follow your passion. Because when I was that age, and I think probably a lot of people at that age, when you hear like follow your passion, I feel like with that comes with a little bit of like a fantastical, unrealistic view of what that actually means, right? Like, let's be very bluntly honest with ourselves. How many people in this world actually get to follow their passion, right? Most professional athletes are probably following their passion, famous singers and actors, and, probably some politicians and whatnot, right? But like, doctors, people in medicine, they're a good number of people. But most people, right? The majority of people don't end up like doing their passion. My passion now, I'm into racing cars. I race vintage race cars, right? I was never going to be a pro race car driver, right? You have to be very wealthy most of the time, or like have some specific set of circumstances that enable you to do it. And so what I think a lot of people need to realize is that, at least to me, so what I would have told myself is that follow your passion is not this like abstract sort of thing about, it's not an emotional thing, right? It's not about like an emotional connection to a thing that you want to do. That's unreasonable. That is not realistic. And it won't lead you to make bad decisions, right? It will lead you to make emotional decisions about what you want to do with your life. What I would say is find your passion, is find the thing that stimulates you intellectually. Like, what is the thing that when you do it, it gets, you can feel your brain getting stimulated and excited about it. Like, what fires you up? And that's a hard thing to know. To some extent, it requires some amount of maturity and self-awareness to know that that's what's happening, right? Because when you're young, I don't know, when I was 22, 21, 20 in college, like what got my brain fired up? I don't know, like girls,
Yeah.
like watching sports. And so a precursor to that is developing a like foundation of maturity and self-awareness, right? So even before, in my mind, you can follow your passion or like find the thing that stimulates you intellectually, is knowing yourself. And that's a little bit of a catch-20, because how do you know if you don't know yourself, if you don't know yourself? It's like,
Yeah.
it's a tough thing. So the advice that I would give to myself, which fortunately the first part I did pursue at that age, is pursue like knowledge of self, whatever format that takes. If that's therapy, cool. It doesn't have to be, right? Go to like classes, or whether it's in school or in some other context, that teach you about sort of like the awareness of what's happening inside your head. If that's like pursuing like Zen Buddhism or something, whatever that is, right? Learn about who you are and be honest. That's the hardest part, is being honest with yourself about who you are, not lying to yourself about like both your faults and your pluses, your skills and positives. And if you can do that, it makes it a lot easier to figure out like, okay, yeah, this is what actually gets me going. Because there's no way I would have the success that I had on my career switch if it didn't happen to be the fact that like problem solving and technical solutioning and like strategic thinking around operations just like really stimulated my mind, right? I was a mediocre attorney, not because I wasn't smart enough or didn't have the skills to do it. I absolutely did. I was a mediocre attorney because I hated it, because it was boring, because it was like mind numbing. It did nothing to stimulate my mind. There was like 5% of the job that stimulated my mind, right? And so I think like to sum up all of that in like sort of a single concept is that it is impossible. Maybe not for everyone. Some people can maybe like grit their teeth and just like power through the dislike of career. I know that there are people out there that can do that. I don't know if that's a good thing anyway, just because you can. Like that sounds like a miserable existence. For me, it's impossible. So the bottom line is like, it is either impossible or much, much, much harder to be great at something that you don't like, right? So don't worry about the outcomes. I know this is very like getting a little like,
Oh,
zen,
this is
whatever,
beautiful.
right?
Keep going.
Right?
I love this.
Like, don't worry about the outcomes. And I know I've heard people said this to me when I was younger, and I remember being like, what are you talking about? But it's very true. If you find something that motivates you and stimulates you, it will be much easier to find success doing it because you will be less resentful of doing it, right? If you're sitting there resenting the work because you hate it, you're never going to go that extra little bit that you need to be a success. Whereas if you love it, you might go that extra little bit to be a success and not even realize you're doing it just because you like doing it, right? Like I remember, especially early on, I mean, I had nights where I would like start working on a problem. I would come home from work and just kind of like be thinking about it, get on my computer, and it would be like midnight. I'd still be working on it and not even realize it. And like what that actually is going the extra mile. But the thought process in my brain wasn't like, I'm going to go home and go the extra mile to solve this. It was like, I want to solve this because it's like I have to solve it because my brain wants to solve it. So that's what I would tell myself, right? I would tell myself, stop worrying about money, stop worrying about outcomes, stop worrying about even like the title or the industry or whatever you think is gonna like look cool on a resume or whatever, any of that, forget it. Just go be a success in something that is amenable to you being a success, and all of that other stuff will happen. Everyone has to get lucky, right? There's an element of luck in everyone's career, so I'm not discounting that. Like it's not a like math problem, right? It's not a 1 + 1 = 2, but it's more of a like statistical distribution, I would say, right? Like your odds of being a huge success are much, much greater if you approach it that way. So that's what I would tell myself.
I think that's a very positive note to end on, Gabe, and I'm so thankful for your time. I really appreciate you dropping by the Tiki Bar. I hope you have an incredible end of year and get to enjoy some time off.
You too, Kevin. Always a pleasure.
Thanks so much.